The question left Edith Bishop's lips before she could pull it back, hanging in the dry evening air between them like smoke from a dying fire. She had not meant to ask it. She had spent 6 weeks convincing herself she did not care about the answer. 6 weeks watching Peter Sawyer ride in and out of Caldwell, Kansas, like the wind had personal business with him, like the horizon was always calling his name louder than any person ever could. 6 weeks telling herself that a drifter was a drifter, that roots were not something a man like him understood, and that she was a fool to let herself feel anything at all. But the words had come out anyway, soft and exposed in the violet dusk of her front yard, and now she stood there with her hands gripping the fence post like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She had asked him if he ever planned to settle down. Peter Sawyer had gone very still. He was standing by his horse, a tall gray roan named Belle, and he had been in the middle of adjusting the saddlebag strap when her question found him. His hands had stopped moving. The last of the day's light caught the side of his face, the jawline rough with 3 days of dark stubble, the eyes the color of worn river stone, and for one terrible moment Edith had seen something move across his expression that she was not prepared for. It was not amusement. It was not the careful blankness he usually wore when things got close to the bone. It was something raw and unguarded and so honest that it made her chest ache. Then he had turned to look at her fully, and he had said it. "I am already planning the porch." 4 words, 5 actually, simple as a nail driven clean into good wood. And they had hit her somewhere behind the sternum with the force of a revelation she had not asked for and was not sure she could survive intact. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She did not know what to say. She was Edith Bishop, 31 years old, widow of Thomas Bishop who had died of a fever 3 years back, owner of the small but solvent Bishop General Goods on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas. She was a woman who balanced ledgers and dried her own herbs and never, not once since Thomas had gone, allowed herself the dangerous luxury of expecting anything from any man. And here was Peter Sawyer, whom she had known for 43 days, telling her he was planning a porch, her porch. He had to mean her porch, the one that needed replacing on the east side, the one he had looked at twice last Tuesday and said nothing about, just looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he is already fixing in his head. She let go of the fence post. He did not move toward her, and she did not move toward him. They just stood there in the gathering dark with 6 weeks of unspoken things between them, and the crickets beginning their evening racket, and Edith Bishop feeling for the first time in 3 years like she was standing at the edge of something enormous. This is where she had to decide whether to step back or lean in. But to understand what that moment truly meant, you had to understand where it had started. You had to go back to the first morning of September, 1878, when Peter Sawyer had ridden into Caldwell with a torn coat, an empty canteen, and a face that looked like it had made peace with hard things a long time ago. Caldwell, Kansas in the fall of 1878 was a cattle town in the full, complicated sense of the word. It sat at the southern edge of the state just above the Kansas Indian Territory line, and the Kishom Trail moved through it like a pulse, bringing drovers and longhorns and trouble in roughly equal measure. The town had a marshal, a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, a livery, a barber, a doctor who was also a dentist, and Edith Bishop's general goods store, which was the most reliable establishment on the street and everyone in Caldwell knew it. Edith had built that reliability herself. Thomas had started the store in 1873 when they had come out from Missouri together, young and hopeful and full of plans that the frontier had a way of testing. He had been a good man, Thomas Bishop, steady and kind and practical in a way that had felt safe to her when she was 25 and new to Kansas. But the fever had taken him in October of 1875, fast and brutal, and Edith had been left with a store, a modest house behind it, a small vegetable plot, and the knowledge that she would have to be enough for herself now because there was no other option. She had been enough, more than enough, honestly. The store had flourished under her management in ways it never quite had under Thomas's. She had an instinct for what people needed before they knew they needed it, and a reputation for honesty so absolute that even the rougher trail hands treated her counter with a kind of unconscious respect. Marshall Holt Greer relied on her judgment in small-town disputes. The women of the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society sought her counsel. She was, in every practical sense, a pillar. What she was not was happy, not unhappy either. She had constructed a life of such thorough adequacy that it had become a kind of armor, and she wore it well, and most days she did not notice the weight of it. Then Peter Sawyer rode in on the 3rd morning of September, 1878, and tied his roan to the post outside her store, and came through the door with dust on everything and a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of tired men. Most men came in off the trail tired. This man came in off the trail like he had simply been in motion, and was now, temporarily, not. Like the stopping was a choice rather than a necessity. Like he could have kept going and just decided not to. He had needed coffee, sugar, a new coat button since 3 of his were missing, and salve for a cut on his left hand that he had wrapped in a strip of cloth that was doing a poor job of the task. Edith had gotten him all 4 things. She had also, without quite deciding to, cleaned and rewrapped the cut properly with the supplies she kept behind the counter for trail emergencies. He had let her do it without protest, which surprised her. Most of the trail men squirmed or made jokes about their toughness. Peter Sawyer had simply watched her hands work with an attention that felt somehow respectful rather than intrusive. "You do that well," he had said. "I have done it many times," she had replied, keeping her eyes on the bandage. "Comes from caring or from practice?" She had glanced up at that because it was an odd question, a perceptive one. "Both," she had said after a moment. He had nodded like that was the right answer. He had paid for his goods, thanked her with a directness that had no performance in it, and gone back to his horse. She had watched him go through the store window without meaning to, and had noticed that he did not ride out toward the trail north or south. He had ridden to the livery instead, which meant he was staying at least one more night. She had told herself it was not interesting. She had gone back to her ledger. He came into the store the next morning for a newspaper, which Caldwell received 2 days late from Wichita, and then the morning after that for tobacco he said he did not actually use, but was buying for a man at the boarding house named Archie who had run out. Edith had seen this particular approach before and recognized it for what it was, which was an excuse. She had said nothing about it. She had sold him the tobacco and the subsequent nails and the subsequent bottle of ink and the subsequent day apple from the barrel by the door which he had paid for, and then stood eating in her store for a good 10 minutes while he read posted notices on the board near the window. "You looking for work?" she had asked, because the board had several notices from ranches looking for hands before winter. "Not ranch work," he had said. "What kind of work then?" He had considered this with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. Useful work, the kind that needs doing and isn't being done. This had been vague enough to be nearly meaningless, and yet somehow she had understood him. There were men like that in every town, men who moved through looking for the broken thing that needed fixing, the gap that needed filling, not because of money, though they needed money like everyone else, but because usefulness was a thing they understood about themselves. She had known one other man like that in her life, and he had been her father, who had spent 40 years fixing fences and barns and carts for neighbors all over Platte County, Missouri, and who had died beloved by everyone and financially modest and entirely at peace. She had felt something shift slightly in her chest at the recognition, and had filed it away under things not to examine. Peter Sawyer had found his useful work within the week. He had started helping at the livery, not as a hired hand exactly, but in an arrangement with Dan Fogarty, the liveryman that seemed to involve labor in exchange for Bell's board. He had also, without being asked, fixed the broken wheel on Widow Clarence's cart on a Tuesday morning, which Widow Clarence had spoken about to approximately everyone in Caldwell by Wednesday afternoon. He had helped young Jerome Pitts, who was 17 and apprenticing at the blacksmith's, hold a difficult stallion steady for shoeing for over an hour without complaint. He had, on a rainy Thursday, sat with old Reuben Alcott on the covered bench outside the post office and played cards for 2 hours because Reuben's arthritis was bad, and he had no one to talk to, and loneliness was as real an ailment as any. Edith had learned all of this not from Peter himself, who said very little about his own activities, but from the natural information network of a small cattle town, where everyone noticed everything and most people told Edith Bishop what they noticed because they trusted her discretion. What she had not yet learned was who he was before Caldwell, where he had come from, why he moved, what the dark past was that she could sense in the weight of his quietness, in the way certain questions made his eyes go to the middle distance for a breath too long. She had not asked. It was not her way to press. And there had been a mutual understanding developing between them that was so careful and so deliberate on both sides that it felt like something being built, slowly, with great attention to whether each piece was sound before the next one was placed. It was on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of September that the thing between them had shifted from potential to undeniable. The day had been ordinary up until 4 in the afternoon, which was when Franklin Cobb had come into the store. Franklin Cobb was a problem that Caldwell had been living with for 2 years. He was 38, broad and mean in the specific way that men become mean when they have enough money and not enough consequence. He owned a spread 8 miles east of town and employed a dozen men, and had a habit of helping himself to things and people and patients that did not belong to him. He was not the worst man Edith had dealt with, but he was the most persistent. He had decided 2 years ago that Edith Bishop, as a widow with a thriving business, would make him a practical wife. He had decided this unilaterally, and had not updated the decision despite 15 months of firm, clear, and repeatedly delivered refusals. He came in that Wednesday with 2 of his hands flanking him like a custom, and he leaned on her counter, and he told her that he had filed an inquiry with the county land office about the strip of land between her store property and the one to the east, which he claimed Thomas Bishop had never properly registered, and that there might be a question about the legal boundary of her property. Edith had looked at him with steady eyes and said that her deed was fully registered and had been since 1873, and that he was welcome to inquire as much as he liked. Cobb had smiled with the front part of his face and said that legal processes were slow and expensive, and that a woman managing alone might find it easier to have a partner who could help with that kind of thing. Edith had said, with absolute pleasantness, that she would have her deed reviewed by the county attorney in Wichita at her earliest convenience, and that she wished him a good afternoon. He had left, but the smile had been the wrong kind of smile, and Edith had felt the cold, specific fear of a person who knows that someone has decided to use power against them, and is wondering how far they will take it. She had not seen Peter in the store that day, but he had been at the livery across the street, and later she learned from Dan Fogarty that Peter had watched Cobb and his men enter the store and had stood in the livery doorway for the full 15 minutes they were inside. He had come to the store just before closing. He had not mentioned Cobb. He had bought a small tin of boot polish and a box of matches, and then, standing at the counter, he had said, "Is there anything you need?" The question had been so quiet and so direct, and so genuinely free of the performance of chivalry, that it had caught her off guard. He had not said it like a man who wanted to ride in and solve a problem. He had said it like a man checking a door to make sure it was sturdy. She had looked at him for a moment, and then she had said, "Not yet, but I may." He had nodded. He had taken his boot polish and his matches. He had said, "I'll be around," and had walked out. And she had stood there behind her counter in the late afternoon light with the absolute knowledge that something was happening between her and Peter Sawyer that she was not going to be able to stop by simply deciding not to let it happen. The situation with Franklin Cobb had escalated faster than she had hoped. By the last week of September, she had written to the county attorney in Wichita, a man named Sterling Galt, who had handled Thomas's original deed registration. Galt had written back efficiently to say that the deed was sound and properly filed, and that any challenge would be without merit, but that if Cobb chose to pursue a formal complaint it could take months to resolve and would cost her money she did not strictly have to spare. She had shared this information with Marshal Holt Greer, who was a decent man but not a powerful one, and who had told her carefully that there was not much he could do about a man filing legal inquiries, even bad faith ones, and that if Cobb made any move to physically interfere with her property or her person, he would act, which was useful as far as it went, which was not far enough. It was Peter who had suggested, over a cup of coffee in the store one morning in early October, that the best approach was documentation. Keep a written record of every interaction with Cobb, every visit, every word, every witness. Make it clear to Cobb through the record, if not directly, that any move he made was being tracked. Make the cost of harassment visible and concrete. "You have done this before," she had said, not a question. "Something like it," he had replied. She had waited, and he had said after a moment, "I was a deputy marshal in Colorado for 3 years, Laramie County." This was the first time he had volunteered anything about his past, and she understood the weight of the offering. "What brought you to Kansas?" She had asked carefully. He had looked into his coffee cup with that particular middle-distance focus she had learned to recognize. "The end of something," he had said. "I needed to be somewhere new for a while." She had not pushed. What ended was a question for a different time, and she had known it, and he had known she knew it, and the whole exchange had been another stone placed carefully on the foundation of what they were building. The documentation strategy had been sound. Edith began keeping a ledger separate from her business accounts, a small leather-bound journal she kept under the counter, and in it she recorded every encounter with Cobb, every unusual incident, every moment that felt like pressure. 3 other merchants on the street, including Dan Fogarty and the barber Emmett Price, agreed to do the same after she explained the situation. The marshal had been informed. The county attorney had been sent a preliminary letter. Cobb had come into the store twice more in October, each time with his hands and each time with some variation of the same veiled ultimatum. Each time Edith had been pleasant, firm, and thorough in her documentation afterward. Each time Peter had happened to be somewhere visible when Cobb arrived, not confrontationally, not in the way of a man making a display, but present in the specific quiet way that communicated awareness. On the 3rd visit, Cobb had glanced out the store window, seen Peter leaning against the livery doorframe across the street, and something in his expression had shifted. He had left sooner than usual. "He's watching you," Edith had said to Peter afterward. "Yes," Peter had said. "Does that concern you?" "No," he had said, and then after a moment, "I've been watched by worse." She had wanted very badly to ask about the worse. She had not. But that evening, after she had locked the store and was walking the short path to her house, she had found Peter sitting on the old broken step of her front porch with a tin mug of coffee he had apparently gotten from somewhere, and he had said, without looking up, "The east side boards need replacing before winter. The 3rd and 7th plank especially." She had looked at him for a long moment. "Are you offering?" She had said, "If you want," he had said. She had said yes, and then gone inside and had stood in her kitchen with her hands flat on the table for a full minute before she was able to start on supper. He had come on a Saturday morning with lumber he had sourced from Price's neighbor who had milled timber for sale, and whom Peter had apparently introduced himself to at some point in the way. He introduced himself to everyone, quietly and practically, and leaving them better disposed toward him than before. He worked through the morning with the steady focus of a man who did not need to prove himself in the work, just needed to do it. Edith had brought coffee and then brought more coffee and eventually had stopped pretending to do other things and had sat on the good steps with her coffee and watched him work. "You're good with your hands," she had said. "My father was a carpenter," he had said, "in Ohio originally, before we came west." "When did you come west?" "I was 12, he had said. 1861. My father had decided there was more future in Colorado than in Ohio." She had done the arithmetic. "That made you about 29 now." 30, he had said. "I turned 30 in August." She had nodded. "I am 31, she had said, which was offering something back, and he had glanced at her with something that might have been warmth. "You seem older," he had said. "That is not a compliment," she had said. "I meant it as one," he had said. "You have the kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are. Most people are still working on it at 31. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "What happened with the deputy marshal work? You left that." He had been quiet too. He had driven a nail with 3 clean strikes before he said, "There was a man, a rancher named Colton Briggs. He had political connections in Denver, and he was running a land fraud operation, taking claims from homesteaders with falsified paperwork. I had been building a case against him for 8 months. My superior was involved. I did not know that until the case collapsed, and when it collapsed on me." She had said nothing, letting the silence be a space he could fill or not. "I was cleared eventually," he had said, "but the job was gone. My reputation in Laramie County was damaged enough that staying made no sense. I had also lost." He had stopped. He had driven another nail. "I had been engaged to a woman there. She did not wait through the investigation." Edith had felt the weight of that, the dark past he carried, the shape of the wound. "I am sorry," she had said. "I was for a while," he had said. "I think I understand it better now. It was not entirely her fault. I had not been honest with her about the risks of the work. I had thought I was protecting her by not telling her, but what I was actually doing was keeping her at a distance and calling it protection." He had looked at Edith then, directly, with the Riverstone eyes. "I have been thinking about that since I got here," he had said. "The difference between protecting someone and keeping distance from them." Her heart had done something alarming inside her chest. She had picked up her coffee mug and looked at it steadily. "That is a meaningful distinction," she had said. "Yes," he had said, "it is." He had finished the porch boards that day and the next day too, because there had been more that needed doing than the 3rd and 7th plank. When he was finished, it was the best porch she had had since the original build in 1873, and she had stood on it and felt its solidity under her feet and had known, in the way you know a thing before you know it consciously, that this was not just carpentry. October had moved into November, and the relationship between them had deepened in the patient, incremental way that things deepen when both people involved have been hurt before and are moving with care. They had taken to sitting on the repaired porch in the evenings after the store was closed, Edith with her mending or her accounts, Peter with a book or simply present, and they had talked in the long, winding way of people who are getting to know each other properly, not performing the best version of themselves, but testing out the real one. She had learned that he had a younger sister in Pueblo, Colorado, named Margaret, who was married to a schoolteacher and had 2 children. He had learned about Missouri and her father, and the way she had come to the frontier feeling like she was following an adventure that had turned out to be mostly very hard work. She had told him about Thomas, carefully and honestly, not making Thomas into a saint or a villain, but into the real man he had been, a good man who had loved her imperfectly, and whom she had loved back in a way that was real, but perhaps had never been the great combustible thing that the novels she read in the evenings described. Peter had listened to all of it with the kind of attention that made a person feel both seen and safe, which was an unusual combination, and one she had not experienced much of in her life. She had also observed, over these weeks, his interactions with the rest of Caldwell's population. He had become, in the quiet, unhurried way of a man who was simply present and useful, a part of the town's fabric. The children liked him because he was serious with them rather than patronizing. Reuben Alcott's arthritis had been better since Peter had sourced a specific liniment from a Mexican trader, passing through, who had told him it came from his grandmother's remedy. The pastor, Reverend Giles, had sought him out to help repair the church roof before the first snow, and Peter had organized 4 other men to do it in a single weekend, including Emmett Price, who had not previously volunteered for community labor in living memory. And Cobb had gone quiet. Not gone and not done, but quiet in the way that meant he was thinking rather than acting, which Edith found more unnerving in some ways than the direct visits. She had kept adding to the documentation journal. She had written Galt in Wichita again to update him. She had been careful. It was on a Thursday evening in the second week of November that Peter had finally said, more directly than he had said anything previously, what was between them. They had been on the porch in the cold, both of them wrapped in coats, the first frost having made the nights sharp and clean. The stars were enormous and near-looking, the way they got in late fall in Kansas, and she had been warm inside her coat and thinking about nothing in particular when he had said her name. Edith. She had looked at him. He had been looking at the sky. "I want to tell you something," he had said. "And I want to tell it to you honestly so that you have all the information before anything else moves forward." Her stomach had done something complicated. "All right," she had said. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "I came to Caldwell with no intention of staying anywhere. I had been moving for 2 years since the Laramie business, and I had gotten used to it, and I had told myself it was what I needed. And it was, for a while. But when I arrived here, something happened that has not happened in the 2 years of moving, which is that I did not want to leave." He had looked at her then. "I did not want to leave because of you specifically. Because of the way you handled the cut on my hand on the first morning without making it a performance of kindness. Because of the way you said both when I asked if your care came from caring or from practice." Edith had felt as though the air had thickened around her. "I should have said this sooner," he had said. "I was working up to it in the only way I know how, which is slowly and with actions rather than words, and I recognize that is not always enough. So I am saying it now with words. I am here because of you, and I would like to be here because of you for as long as that is something you want." The silence had stretched, not awkwardly but with the kind of fullness that means a moment is holding something important. "You are not easy to read, Peter Sawyer," she had said finally. "I know," he had said. "I am working on it." "Are you?" she had said, and her voice had done something she had not intended, something warm and fractionally unsteady. "Yes," he had said, "with specific regard to you." And then, because she was Edith Bishop, and she did not do things halfway once she had decided to do them, she had reached across the space between their chairs and taken his hand where it rested on his knee. He had turned his palm up and closed his fingers over hers, and they had sat there on the porch she had fixed in the cold November dark, holding hands like two people who had been handed something precious and were being very careful with it. They had stayed like that for a long time without speaking, and Edith had felt, moving through her slowly like warmth moving through cold hands, the particular joy of a thing not lost but found. Of a capacity she had thought perhaps exhausted inside her turning out to be simply dormant. Franklin Cobb had made his real move on a Monday morning in mid-November, and it had been worse than the property boundary threat. He had come to the store with a document from a man named Harlan Fitch, who operated a supply company out of Wichita. The document was an invoice claiming that Thomas Bishop had owed Fitch's company $340 in unpaid goods at the time of his death, and that this debt had transferred by law to the estate of Edith Bishop as sole heir and executor. The invoice was dated 1875. Edith had looked at the document with a face that revealed nothing, and then looked at Cobb, and said she would need to review it with counsel. Cobb had said that Fitch was prepared to take legal action to recover the debt, including a lien on the store property, unless of course the matter was settled privately. He had smiled the wrong smile again. He had said that he had spoken to Fitch, and had arranged that if Edith were to transfer the disputed East Strip to him, and agree to a partnership arrangement, Fitch would consider the debt satisfied. He had left the document on the counter and walked out. Edith had stood very still for approximately 90 seconds, And then she had gone to the door of the store and locked it and put up the closed sign. And she had sat down on the stool behind the counter. And she had let herself feel the full weight of what was happening to her. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion of a woman who had built something entirely by herself and was now watching someone try to dismantle it from outside. She had let herself feel all of it for exactly 5 minutes, which was what she allowed herself. And then she had gotten up and gone to the door and unlocked it and put the open sign back. And she had begun drafting a letter to Galt in Wichita. Peter had come in around noon for the coffee that had become a daily habit, and he had known immediately from her face that something was wrong. She had shown him the invoice. He had read it carefully. Then he had looked up. "This is fraudulent," he had said. "Thomas Bishop ordered from a supplier in Kansas City, not Wichita. I know because I read his old order books when you showed me the record-keeping system 3 weeks ago." "Yes," she had said. "I know. I have records going back to 1873. There is no Harlan Fitch in any of them." "Cobb manufactured it," he had said. "Yes." He had looked at the document again, and she had seen something move in his face that was quiet and controlled and quite serious. "This is fraud," he had said again, more specifically. "A manufactured debt used to extort property transfer. That is a federal offense." Edith had felt something shift in the room. "You know the law," she had said. "I spent 3 years enforcing it," he had said. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "Edith, I need to tell you something else about my past that I have not told you yet." She had waited. "When I left Laramie County," he had said, "I was cleared of the charges, but the man who had framed me, Colton Briggs, he had connections that reached further than Colorado. I spent 8 months after leaving Laramie documenting what I knew about his operation, working with a federal circuit court contact I had from my time as deputy. That case is still moving through federal court. It moves slowly, but it is moving." He had paused. "I have a contact at the federal marshal's office in Wichita. A man named Devereaux. I have been in correspondence with him about the Briggs case." Edith had looked at him steadily. "And you think Devereaux could help with this?" "I think Devereaux would be very interested in a manufactured debt used to extort property from a widow," Peter had said. "Especially if Harlan Fitch is a real person in Wichita who is being used by Cobb without his knowledge, which is possible, or if Fitch is Cobb's creation entirely, which would be worse for Cobb." He had looked at her with the direct, clear look she had come to trust completely. "I can write to Devereaux today. I can have a response within the week, but I want you to decide this. It is your store, your property, your life. I will do whatever you think is right." She had loved him in that moment. She had not said it. She had not even fully formed the thought in words. But she had felt it in the absolute cellular way you feel the things that are true, and she had known it even as she filed it away to examine later. "Write to Devereaux," she had said. "Today." The letter had gone out that afternoon. While they waited, Peter had helped Edith compile a comprehensive counter-document. Every order record from Thomas's supplier books, every account ledger since 1873 showing no such debt, the deed registration documents, the full record of Cobb's harassment from the documentation journal, and affidavits from Dan Fogarty and Emmett Price attesting to what they had witnessed. Devereaux had responded in 5 days. He had, it turned out, already been investigating Cobb in connection with a separate land fraud complaint from 2 homestead families east of Caldwell, whose claims Cobb had challenged through a network of false legal filings. Harlan Fitch, Devereaux confirmed, was a real supplier in Wichita who had never heard of Thomas Bishop, and who, when contacted by Devereaux's office, had immediately stated that someone had forged his company's letterhead. Devereaux was coming to Caldwell. He arrived on a Wednesday in late November, a careful, sharp-eyed man in his late 40s who wore his authority quietly and took Edith's documentation with the appreciation of a professional who recognized good record-keeping. He had spoken at length with Peter, who had provided everything he knew about Cobb's methods and connections, drawing on his Laramie experience to map the pattern of how men like Cobb operated. Devereaux had interviewed Cobb the following morning. Edith had not been present, but Peter had been, at Devereux's request, and he had told her afterward that Cobb had unraveled quickly when confronted with the forged letterhead and the 2 homestead complaints and the full weight of a federal investigation. Cobb had tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, then a clerical error, and then, when neither of those held, had hired a lawyer in Wichita who had advised him to settle. The property claim had been withdrawn. The false invoice had been formally declared a forgery. Cobb had agreed, as part of the settlement Devereux's office had brokered, to provide financial restitution to the 2 homestead families and to withdraw all legal challenges to properties in the Caldwell area. He was not jailed, which had frustrated Edith initially, but Devereux had explained that the evidence was sufficient for civil action, but that criminal prosecution would require more time and resources than his current mandate allowed, and that the agreement was binding and enforceable, and that Cobb's political connections had been sufficiently damaged by the investigation that he would not risk further action. Cobb had left Caldwell 3 days later. Rumor was he was moving his operation to Oklahoma Territory. Edith had felt an enormous calm settle over her life in his absence, the calm of a threat finally lifted, and had stood in her store on a clear November morning and felt something that was almost peace. Peter had come in that morning and bought a coffee and leaned on her counter and said, "It is over." "Yes," she had said. "How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe properly," she had said. "For the first time in 2 months." He had looked at her with the Riverstone eyes, and there was something in them that was so open and so full that she had had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much. The capacity for that much feeling directed at you, steady and patient and real, was an enormous and slightly terrifying thing, but she had looked back, and she had said, "Thank you. You built the case yourself," he had said. "I just added a connection." "You added more than a connection," she had said, "and you know it." He had been quiet, and then he had said, "Edith," and then he had stopped and she had waited, and he had said, "I would like to take you to dinner." At Hallie's, which was the restaurant on the south end of the main street, modest but decent, with tablecloths and candles on Friday evenings. Properly, not coffee at your counter. She had felt the smile before she could arrange her face to manage it. "Friday," she had said. "Friday," he had agreed. It had been the best dinner she could remember having in a very long time, not because the food had been remarkable, though it had been good, but because of the quality of the conversation, the ease of it, the way 2 people who have been talking carefully for weeks will sometimes cross a threshold into talking freely and find on the other side of it something that is almost effortless. They had talked about everything, Colorado and Missouri and Ohio and the future. And she had noticed for the first time that he spoke about the future in the first-person plural rather than the singular, not noticeably, not in a performed way, just as if it were natural to him now to fold her into his thinking about what came next. He had walked her to her door afterward, and on the porch he had newly boarded, in the cold November night. He had taken her face in his hands with the same quality of care he brought to everything, and he had kissed her. And she had let herself be kissed, and it had been quiet and certain and entirely without performance. And she had thought, standing there on the planks he had set and nailed and made solid, that this was what it felt like to be found by someone who was actually looking for you, and not for an idea of you. December had come with the first real snow, and with it a rhythm to their days that felt, without either of them declaring it, like the rhythm of 2 lives that had decided to run in the same direction. He was still at the boarding house technically, though he was at her house or her store for most of the hours of the day. He had fixed the hinge on the back door and the shutter that kept coming loose on the west window, and had built a storage shelf for the store's back room that increased her inventory capacity by 1/3. He had written to his sister Margaret in Pueblo and told her about Edith, which he had mentioned to Edith with a kind of quiet deliberateness that told her he wanted her to know he was telling people, that she was someone he was telling people about. Margaret had written back, and the letter had been warm and funny, and had mentioned 3 times that she hoped they would visit in the spring, which had made Edith feel welcomed into something before she had even been asked to enter it. The question had come on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, on the porch again, though they were bundled now against the cold, and the snow was coming down soft and light, and the whole world had gone quiet around them in the way it does under snow. She had not planned to ask it. She had been thinking about the store's order for the spring dry goods, which she needed to send before Christmas to ensure delivery by March. And she had been thinking about how Peter had, again without fanfare, sat down with her books that week and helped her identify 3 areas where she was paying more than necessary for goods, because her supplier contracts had not been renegotiated since Thomas's time. He had savings knowledge from the ranchers and traders he had talked to in his months in Caldwell, and he had used it to draft a more advantageous terms proposal that she planned to send with the order. She had been thinking about all of this, about the practical intimacy of a person who helps you with your books, and she had been thinking about the future that was beginning to feel very real and very close, and she had looked at him in the lamplight spilling from the window onto the snowy porch, and the question had come out before she could stop it. She had asked him if he ever planned to settle down, and he had gone still, and he had turned to look at her, and he had said it. Simple and certain as a nail in good wood, "I am already planning the porch." She had let go of the fence post. He had not moved toward her. She had not moved toward him. The snow was still coming down. "You meant this porch," she had said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," he had said. "You have been planning it for some time," she had said. "Since approximately October," he had said. "When I realized that every morning I woke up in that boarding house, the first thing I thought about was what I could do that day that would be useful to you specifically. That was when I understood that I was not leaving." She had felt her throat do something inconvenient. "Peter," she had said. "I am not saying this to pressure you," he had said quickly. "I know that you have built a life entirely by yourself and that it is a good life. I am not trying to walk into it and take it over. I am saying that if you want to, I would like to be part of it, in whatever way makes sense, in whatever way feels right to you." She had looked at him in the snow for a long time. There was so much in what he was, so much that she trusted and valued and felt moved by, and there was the practical reality of her life and her store, and the fact that she had managed alone for 3 years, and had told herself she did not need anyone and had believed it. And there was the other reality, which was that needing someone and wanting someone were different things, and that the not wanting had been a kind of unexamined grief that she was only now beginning to understand the shape of. "I would like that," she had said, "in whatever way makes sense." He had exhaled slowly, and she had seen in his face the thing behind the stillness, the thing he carried so carefully, which was an enormous, patient, entirely unperformed love that had been there for weeks and had simply been waiting for her to meet it. He had crossed the space between them and she had stepped into it, and he had put his arms around her, and she had put her face against his coat, and they had stood on the porch in the December snow holding each other with the kind of wordless recognition that is better than any declaration. Christmas in Caldwell that year had been the first Christmas in 3 years that Edith had not felt the particular loneliness of celebration, without someone to celebrate with. The town had its traditions, the church service, the community supper in the hall, the children's program with its earnest pageantry, and she had participated in all of them as she always had. But this year Peter had been beside her at the church supper, and had helped her carry the 3 pies she had made for the communal table, and had sat next to Reuben Alcott, and made the old man laugh 3 times with something she could not quite hear from across the table. She had watched him from across the room and felt the steady warmth of a thing decided settling into her bones. He had given her a gift on Christmas morning, brought to the store before she had opened it, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It had been a book, a new edition of a botanical reference that she had mentioned in passing 6 weeks earlier when they had been talking about the medicinal plants she grew in her kitchen garden. He had marked 3 pages inside with small strips of paper where he had found plants specifically suited to Kansas soil, and in the front cover he had written in his careful, unhurried hand, "For Edith, who makes things grow." She had had to put it down and stand at the back of the store for a moment with her hand over her mouth. She had given him a new coat to replace the one he had come into Caldwell with, wool-lined against the Kansas winter, in a dark blue that she had known would suit him, and that did. He had put it on immediately, and said it was the best coat he had owned, and she had straightened the collar with her hands in the way of a person who has a right to touch someone and is quietly aware of it. January had been cold and close and full of warmth. Peter had moved from the boarding house not with any announcement, but simply in the gradual way of a man whose possessions were increasingly at one address and increasingly not at another, until by the second week of the month the boarding house key had been returned to its hook, and his books were on the shelf in her sitting room and Belle was in her small stable, and the house had a quality of fullness it had not had in years. It was on a clear January evening, with the fire going and the kettle on and the snow against the windows, that he had said the formal thing. He had been sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she had been writing to a supplier and he had been reading, and then he had set his book down and looked at her. "I would like to marry you," he had said. She had put down her pen. "I know," she had said. He had looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "Is that all? I would like to marry you too," she had said. "I was waiting for you to ask." "I am asking." "Then yes," she had said simply. He had reached across the table and taken her hand, and they had sat there with the fire and the snow and the lamp between them, and it had been the most ordinary, extraordinary moment of her life. They had married in March, when the first real thaw had come, and the mud on the main street was drying, and the prairie beyond the town was showing the first pale green of coming spring. Reverend Giles had performed the ceremony in the church on a Saturday morning, with about 40 of Caldwell's residents in attendance, including Dan Fogarty and Emmett Price and Reuben Alcott, who had made the walk on his arthritis without complaint, and including, by telegraph connection, Peter's sister Margaret, who had sent a letter that Reverend Giles had read aloud during the ceremony. A letter so warm and funny and heartfelt that 3 people in the congregation had cried, including Peter, which he had not appeared to expect, and which Edith had found profoundly and unexpectedly dear. She had worn a dress she had made herself from good ivory wool with blue trim at the cuffs and collar. He had worn the dark blue coat. They had both looked, as Dan Fogarty had said afterward with his characteristic bluntness, like 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing. The wedding supper had been in the hall and had gone until nearly midnight, which was late for Caldwell on a Saturday, and Edith had danced, which she had not done in years, and Peter had danced with her with the same quality of focus he brought to everything, the same settled attentiveness that made her feel like the most important thing in the room. Spring had come fully, and with it a new energy in both of them, the kind of energy that comes from having decided something big and finding yourself on the other side of the decision, with everything still intact and better. The store had a record April in sales, partly because Peter had finished the new back room shelf, and the increased inventory had allowed her to stock goods she had previously had to turn customers away for, and partly because his easy community presence had brought people in who had not been regular customers before. He had taken on some deputy work for Marshal Greer on a temporary basis, as the spring cattle season brought more traffic and more trouble to Caldwell, and he had done this with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, earning Greer's respect quickly and thoroughly. They had also, in the early weeks of spring, written to Margaret in Pueblo with news of the wedding and the real intention of visiting in summer. Margaret's response had come with such velocity and enthusiasm that Edith had laughed out loud reading it, and the summer visit had been scheduled and looked forward to as a fixed point on the horizon. It had been in May that Edith had understood she was with child. She had known before she had known it in the way of the body making itself legible in small, quiet shifts. She had told Peter on a Sunday evening on the porch, which had become the place where real things were said between them, and she had watched his face move through surprise into something so full and warm, and wondering that she had felt almost shy under it. "Edith," he had said, and his voice had done the thing that her voice had done on the porch in November, that fractional unsteadiness that meant the feeling was large. "I know," she had said. "Are you?" he had begun. "Very well," she had said. "Entirely well, happy." She had paused, frightened a little. "Yes," he had said. "Me too." And then he had pulled her against him, and she had rested her head on his shoulder, and they had sat there on the porch in the May evening with the prairie wind coming in warm and soft, and the full measure of what their life was becoming moving through them both. The summer visit to Pueblo had been everything it was intended to be. Margaret Sawyer, now Margaret Holt, was a small, sharp-eyed woman with her brother's quality of direct attentiveness and a gift for warmth that was immediate and genuine. Her husband Charles was the school teacher, mild and bookish and kind, and their children, a boy of 6 named James and a girl of 4 named Clara, had taken to Edith with the instinctive openness of children who have been loved well and extend it freely. Margaret had embraced Edith in the Holt family's front yard before they had exchanged 3 words, which had been entirely unexpected and entirely welcome. She had held Edith at arm's length and looked at her with those same river-stone eyes she had given to her brother and had said, "You are exactly right," which had been peculiar and perfect. They had stayed a week, and it had been a week of long meals and long conversations, and a quality of easy belonging that Edith had not had with family since her own parents had died, her father in 1870 and her mother the year after. She had felt, sitting at Margaret's table with Peter on one side and James climbing onto her lap with a picture he had drawn, the full and particular joy of a person who has found their way back into something. The drive back to Caldwell had taken 3 days and had been one of the finest stretches of time in Edith's memory, the two of them on the wagon bench with the summer land around them, and the conversation moving in and out of comfortable silence and comfortable talk, and the baby making itself felt now in a real and undeniable way, and everything, for once, feeling precisely as it should. They had returned to Caldwell in August to find that Marshal Greer had formally offered Peter a permanent deputy position, which they had discussed at length on the porch over 2 evenings. The concerns were real, the risks of the work, the instability she had feared in Thomas's time when a man's life was held by such thin things as luck and timing. Peter had been straightforward about all of it, about the risk and about his own capabilities, and about the fact that Caldwell was a town he wanted to be invested in, not just passing through. "You took 3 years of risks as a deputy in Colorado," she had said. "Yes," he had said. "And you are better at it now than you were then," she had said. "I believe so," he had said. "And Greer is not your superior in Laramie County," she had said. "He is not," he had said. "Then say yes," she had said. He had looked at her with those eyes. "You are sure?" "I am sure of you," she had said. "Say yes." He had said yes, and they had shaken Greer's hand the next morning, and the town had been quietly glad of it in the way that Caldwell was glad of things, practically and without excessive ceremony. September had come around again, the first anniversary of Peter Sawyer riding into her store with a torn coat and a cut hand, and Edith had marked it privately with a feeling of such complete richness that she had stood in the store in the early morning before opening and simply felt it for a few minutes, all of it, the enormous distance between who she had been the morning he walked in and who she was now. The baby had come in November, 2 weeks before it was expected, in the way that first children have of arriving on their own schedule without regard for anyone's preparations. The midwife had been there, Mrs. Potter, a capable woman who had delivered most of the children currently living in Caldwell under the age of 10. Peter had been at the house and had been allowed to stay, which was not universally the custom but which Edith had been firm about, and which Mrs. Potter had accepted with only a small raised eyebrow. It had been a hard labor, 12 hours of it, and Edith had been exhausted and present and entirely herself throughout, which Mrs. Potter had said afterward was either admirable or frightening, depending on how you looked at it. Peter had been outside the room for most of it, which was the compromise, and had come in twice when Edith had asked for him, and had held her hand both times with the steady, unwavering presence that was the most fundamentally himself thing about him. The baby had been a boy. He had been red and furious and healthy, and they had named him Thomas James, Thomas for Edith's first husband because it was a name of a good man and deserved to continue, and James for Peter's nephew in Pueblo. Mrs. Potter had cleaned him up and put him in Edith's arms, and Peter had come in then, and stood beside the bed, and looked at his son for the first time with an expression that was entirely beyond language. Edith had looked up at Peter looking at Thomas James, and had felt something so complete and so enormous that she had not tried to name it. She had simply let it be there, in the room with the lamp burning low and the November cold outside and the baby in her arms, and the man she loved standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and everything, all of it, resolved. That first winter with Thomas James had been full and warm and exhausting in the way of all winters with new babies, the sleeplessness and the constant small urgencies, and the particular tenderness of watching Peter with his son, the way he held him with the same quiet competence he brought to physical work, the way he talked to him in a low, continuous murmur when he was restless at night, the way he had learned very quickly exactly how Thomas James liked to be carried, which was over the left shoulder with his father's hand flat on his back, and had carried him that way every time without being told. He had also, in December of that year, when the baby was 6 weeks old and Edith was returning to something like her full capacity, begun building the extended porch. The east side he had repaired on those early Saturdays had been the beginning. What he built now was a full wraparound porch on the south and east sides of the house, with a roof over it for the summer heat and the Kansas rains. He worked on it on days off and in the hours after his shifts, steadily and without urgency, with the lumber he had sourced from the same mill as the first boards, good oak that would hold. Reuben Alcott had come to watch one Saturday morning, and had sat on the unfinished boards in the thin winter sun, and had told Peter 3 separate anecdotes from his own homesteading years that had no direct bearing on porch construction, but which Peter had listened to with complete attention. Edith had brought them both coffee and had sat for a while with Thomas James in her arms, and had watched the two of them and felt the fullness of it, the way a life accretes meaning not in the large gestures but in the accumulated ordinary tenderness of staying. Reuben Alcott had died in January of that year, peacefully, in his room at the boarding house. He had been 73. The whole of Caldwell had come to the service, and Peter had been one of the 4 men who carried the casket, and Edith had stood in the cold church and felt the grief of it, the genuine loss of a particular human presence in the world that would not be replaced, and had also felt, because the two things were not incompatible, the gratitude of having known him. Peter had sat with her after the service on their porch, the new broad porch, and they had talked about Reuben for a long time, and the talking had been a good kind of grief, the kind that honors. Spring came back and Thomas James was 4 months old and sitting up with support, and had developed an opinion about everything, including which spoon he was fed with, which was the smaller one, and not the other one, and he would tell you so if you brought the wrong one. He had Peter's eyes, which was a thing that caught Edith sometimes, that riverstone color looking up at her from a small face learning the world. The store had continued to flourish. Peter's deputy work was going well, though the spring cattle season always brought the harder weeks, the fights and the thefts, and the occasional serious trouble that went with trail money and trail men. He had handled all of it with the particular competence of someone who had seen enough to know when to be firm and when to be patient, and Marshall Greer had said to Edith once, in passing, that Peter Sawyer was the best deputy he had ever had, which Greer, being Greer, had said as a matter of fact rather than a compliment, which made it feel more true. There was one serious incident that spring. A trail boss named Kelso had brought a dispute into town that had started on the range and escalated to the point where two of his men were armed and threatening a local farmer named Abe Stearns over a water rights matter that had legitimate legal dimensions, but was being handled in the very illegitimate way of men with guns. Peter had gone to the scene alone first, which Edith had only learned afterward, and which had made her breath go short for a moment. He had talked Kelso down by speaking directly and specifically to his financial interests, laying out the exact legal consequences of any violence on Kansas soil to drovers passing through, and Kelso, being primarily a practical man, had recognized the wisdom and backed his men down. The water rights matter had gone to Greer, who had referred it to the county board, where it had been resolved without further incident. Peter had come home that evening and told her all of it, which she had come to understand was his commitment to her, the transparency he had described on that October evening when he told her about the Laramie mistake, keeping her informed rather than protecting her through distance. She had listened to all of it, and then she had said, "You handled that well," and he had said, "I was somewhat concerned in the middle," and she had laughed, which was not entirely the response she had intended but which had felt right. "Were you ever not concerned in the middle?" she had asked. "Almost never," he had said, and his mouth had done the small almost smile that she had catalogued as one of her favorite things about him. "That seems like a healthy quality in a deputy marshal," she had said. "Greer never seems concerned," he had said. "Greer is also 61 and has been doing this for 20 years, she had said. "Give yourself time." He had looked at her with a warmth that still had the capacity to take her breath slightly, and he had said, "I intend to give myself a great deal of time here." And she had said, "Good," and that had been that. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that hit the surrounding farms harder than the town itself, but that affected everyone in the ripple-out way of an agricultural community under pressure. Several farm families came into Caldwell needing to renegotiate supply accounts, and Edith had extended credit carefully and documented it just as carefully, because she needed the business to stay solvent while also understanding that the families who grew the food and raised the cattle that made the whole economy of the region function needed to survive the drought to come back to prosperity. Peter had helped coordinate a community effort to move water from the creek to 3 particularly hard-hit farms, organizing the labor and the logistics with the same ease he brought to the church roof and Reuben Alcott's company, and everything else that needed organizing. It had taken 2 Saturdays and the cooperation of about 12 men, including Charles Brody, the young man who had taken over at the blacksmiths from old Ed Sawyer, and Jerome Pitts, who was now 20 and fully apprenticed and strong as a door. The drought broke in August with a week of steady rain that had the whole town breathing out together. The farms recovered. The accounts were settled by the following spring. Edith had noted the final repayment in her ledger with a satisfaction that was about more than money. Thomas James had taken his first real steps on a September morning in 1880, exactly 2 years after the morning Peter had first walked into the store. He had been standing at the low shelf in the sitting room holding on, and he had looked across the room at his father who was sitting on the floor 6 feet away, and he had let go of the shelf and walked, with the tremendous concentration of a 10-month-old who is applying his entire available intellect to the task, across the floor, and arrived at Peter's knee. Peter had caught him and lifted him and held him up and said, with a quality of wonder he made no attempt to contain, "There you are." Edith, watching from the doorway, had felt the full warm weight of the life they had built settle into her chest and stay. By the spring of 1881, Caldwell was growing. The railroad was coming through, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line that was threading itself across Kansas with a deliberate expansion southward, and the news of a depot had brought with it the particular energy of a town that knows it is about to become something larger than it has been. New buildings were going up on the west end of the main street. 2 new families had arrived with the intention of setting up businesses. The population was nudging toward 600. Edith had expanded the store to include a dry goods section on the east side where the old storage room had been, and had hired a young woman named Clara Hennessy, 18 and recently arrived from Missouri, as a shop assistant. Clara was quick and capable and funny in a dry, understated way that Edith appreciated, and she had taken to the store's systems with a facility that had Edith, within 3 weeks, trusting her with the counter alone on Tuesday afternoons. Peter had been promoted to chief deputy under Marshal Greer, who was talking, with the increased population, about bringing on a 3rd officer. The railroad's arrival would bring more traffic and more of everything that came with traffic, both good and complicated. It was in June of 1881 that Edith had understood she was carrying a 2nd child. She had told Peter in the kitchen this time, not on the porch, because it was a rainy evening and they were inside with Thomas James asleep and the lamp on and coffee on the table, and the telling had been easy and warm and full of the specific joy of 2 people who have done this before and know what to expect and love what they found the first time. "Are you well?" he had asked, which was always his first question. "Entirely," she had said. "Tired earlier, but well." He had reached across and taken her hand in the same gesture as the kitchen table in January of 1879, the clean, uncomplicated certainty of a man who knows he wants to hold your hand and holds it. "I have been thinking," he had said, "about the north room. It is used for storage now, but it would make a fine room for children if the shelf were moved." She had looked at him and felt the smile come up entirely on its own. "You are already planning the room," she had said. He had looked at her with full comprehension of what she was referencing, the December evening on the porch 2.5 years ago that had changed everything, and his eyes had done the warm thing. "I am always planning something," he had said. "I know," she had said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." He had brought her hand to his mouth and kissed the back of it with a gentleness that was so entirely characteristic of him, and so entirely sufficient that she had felt the full warm certainty of who they were together settle through her like light. The 2nd child had come in February of 1882, a girl this time. They had named her Ruth, which had been Edith's mother's name, a name she had been carrying forward in her heart since 1871, waiting for the right life to place it in. Ruth Margaret Bishop Sawyer had arrived in the early morning with a decisiveness that the midwife Mrs. Potter, who was now something of a family friend, had characterized as clear evidence of a personality. She had been smaller than Thomas James had been and louder in her initial opinions about being in the world, and Thomas James, who was 2.5 and had been prepared by his father with great thoroughness for the arrival of a sibling, had looked at her in her mother's arms with an expression of searching appraisal and then said, "All right," in a tone that suggested she had passed some internal standard, which had made both his parents laugh long and hard. Margaret and Charles had come from Pueblo for the summer when Ruth was 6 months old, and this had been the most complete version of the life Edith had envisioned in the best, most guarded parts of herself during the 3 years she had been alone, and convincing herself adequacy was enough. The table had been full. The porch had been full. The children had played together in the yard with the pragmatic physical joy of small children who have no other agenda, and James Holt, who was now 9, had taken it upon himself to teach Thomas James things of great urgency, including how to tie a specific knot and how to identify the call of a meadowlark. And Thomas James, 3 now and of the opinion that 9-year-olds were approximately gods, had absorbed all of it with enormous seriousness. Margaret had sat with Edith on the porch in the evening after the children were asleep, the 2 of them with coffee and the warm July dark around them, and had said, "You have made him so happy." "He has made me happy," Edith had said. "We have made each other," Margaret had looked at her with the river stone eyes. "He was so lost after Laramie," she had said. "I watched him move for 2 years, and I did not know if anything would stop him. I did not know if anything could." "Something did," Edith had said. "You did," Margaret had said. "And I want you to know that from the bottom of my heart I am grateful to you for it, for being the kind of person who was worth stopping for." Edith had felt the warmth of that in her chest, the generous fullness of it. "He stopped himself," she had said. "I just provided a reason." "The right reason," Margaret had said. "That is the harder thing." They had sat together in comfortable silence after that, and Edith had looked at the porch boards, the first ones he had laid and the wraparound ones he had added, the whole solid length of the thing that was both architecture and declaration. And she had felt the profound and simple truth of a life that had been built one careful piece at a time by two people willing to be honest with each other. The railroad depot had opened in Caldwell in October of 1882, and it had been everything they had expected in terms of transformation. The town had grown faster than at any point in its history. New families, new businesses, new energy, and new complications. Peter had been busy in the way of a man whose professional skills were fully claimed by circumstances, and Edith had been busy in the way of a businesswoman whose market had suddenly expanded by 30%. They had been tired in the evenings in a way that was companionable rather than depleting, the tiredness of two people pulling together and covering ground. Marshall Greer had retired at the end of 1882, citing his age and the winter in his joints, and Peter had been appointed marshal, not deputy marshal, by the town council. He had sat with the appointment letter in his hand for a long time. Edith had read it over his shoulder and then had gone around to face him and had looked at his expression for a long moment. "You are not going to say something modest," she had said. "I was preparing to," he had said. "Don't," she had said. "You have earned it. You are the right person for it. Say yes." He had looked at her with all of it in his eyes, everything that he was, everything they had been, everything they were moving toward. "Yes," he had said. He had been marshal of Caldwell, Kansas, from January of 1883. He had done it well, which surprised no one who knew him, and which he himself had always known he would if given the proper conditions. The town continued to grow and to encounter the challenges of growth, the friction between established residents and new arrivals, the ongoing complications of cattle trade and rail traffic, the periodic serious trouble that came with any frontier town finding its feet in a changing era. He had handled all of it with the qualities that had always been his: the directness, the patience, the ability to see past the surface of a conflict to the actual need beneath it, the refusal to use authority as a substitute for reason. He had built a department of 3 officers by 1884, including Jerome Pitts, who had left the blacksmith trade and discovered a genuine aptitude for law work, and a quiet, competent young man named Wallace who had come through on the railroad and had decided to stay. By the summer of 1884, Thomas James was 4.5 and Ruth was 2.5, and the household ran with a particular lively, organized chaos that Edith managed with the same instinct she brought to the store, knowing where everything and everyone needed to be and providing a structure that was firm enough to be safe and loose enough to let everything grow. The children were healthy and stubborn and funny and completely unlike each other in temperament. Thomas James methodical and quiet like his father, Ruth immediate and loud and definite in all her opinions. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, March of 1884, Peter had come home from his shift and found the house with the children at Margaret Potter's, the one not the midwife but the young woman of that name who had become their neighbor the previous year and who took the children on occasion for exactly this kind of purpose. Edith had made supper, a proper supper, roast chicken and the bread she made on Sundays, and an apple cake with the dried apples from the barrel that had started the whole thing. They had sat across the table from each other with the lamp between them in the exact posture of the January evening when he had said he would like to marry her. And they had eaten and talked in the long, unhurried way they always talked. And she had thought about what 5 years amounted to. The full accreted weight of it. Every morning and every evening and every conversation and every difficulty navigated, and every joy amplified by being shared. And she had felt it with such complete fullness that she had said nothing for a moment but had just looked at him across the table. He had looked back. "What are you thinking?" he had asked. "I am thinking," she had said, "about the first morning you walked into the store, the cut on your hand. You asked me if my care came from caring or from practice." "I remember," he had said. "I said both," she had said, "but I had the proportions wrong. It was mostly practice then. I had almost forgotten what caring felt like." She had paused. "I know now." He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "When I rode into Caldwell, I was not looking for anything. I had stopped looking. I thought that was wisdom. And now," she had said, "now," he had said, "I think the best things find you when you stop performing the search and just start being useful where you are." She had felt the smile come up and stay. "That is very nearly a philosophy," she had said. "I have been working on it," he had said, and his mouth had done the small, almost smile, and she had reached across the table and taken his hand, and he had turned his palm up and closed his fingers over hers, and the whole of their life together had been in that gesture, all 5 years of it, all the years still ahead. They had sat there for a long time, in the lamp-warm kitchen with the wind outside and the settled quiet of a house that had been thoroughly inhabited by people who chose to be in it. And the anniversary had been what all the best evenings were, which was nothing extraordinary and everything. Simply two people who had been honest with each other and had built something real from the honesty. The porch was still there. It would always be there. He had built it to last. In the years that followed, Caldwell would grow into a proper town, with a proper school building and a library donated by a merchant from Ohio who arrived in 1885, and a new church large enough for all its people, and a rail connection that made it a genuine stop on the commercial map of southern Kansas. Peter Sawyer would serve as its marshal for 11 years, until 1894, with a reputation that reached beyond the county into the wider network of law enforcement across the territory. A reputation built not on the dramatic incidents that made newspaper copy, but on the patient, continuous, unglamorous work of keeping a community whole. Edith Bishop Sawyer's store would expand twice more and would become, by the time their children were grown, one of the most established commercial properties in the county. She would train 3 young women as shopkeepers after Clara Hennessy married and moved to Wichita, and all 3 of them would go on to run businesses of their own, which Edith would consider among the best things she had accomplished. Thomas James would grow into a man with his father's eyes and his mother's exactness, and would study law in Kansas City and return to Caldwell to practice it, which was exactly the kind of poetic completion that real lives occasionally permitted. Ruth would grow into a woman of very strong opinions about everything including politics, which was not entirely unexpected, and would become, in the 1890s, one of the founding members of the Caldwell Women's Suffrage Committee, which would not surprise her father and would make her mother quietly and entirely proud. A third child had come in 1887, a boy named Samuel, who had been born in the same bedroom as the other 2, and had arrived in the early evening with such calm and dispatch that Mrs. Potter, now officially their family midwife by virtue of having delivered all 3, had said that at least one of their children had learned to consider other people's schedules. Samuel would grow up to be the funniest person in Caldwell, which was the kind of gift that skips generations and comes from somewhere unexpected, and which would make the dinner table a considerable entertainment for the rest of his childhood. On the porch on a September evening in 1885, 7 years after the first September, Edith had been sitting with Peter in the late-day warmth while the children played in the yard. Thomas James, 6 now, was building a small structure from sticks with the focused intention of his father. Ruth, 3, was narrating the construction in a running commentary that no one had asked for and everyone was receiving. Samuel was 2 months old and asleep in Edith's arms with the complete commitment to sleep that characterized him from the beginning. Peter had been watching all of it with an expression she had learned by now as well as she knew anything, the particular warm, comprehensive attention he brought to the things that were most his. "Are you still planning the porch?" she had said. He had looked at her and then at the porch around them, the broad boards, the roof over them, the full solid structure of it. And then he had looked at the children and back at her. "I am planning the next one," he had said. "There is no next one," she had said. "The porch is finished." "There is always a next one," he had said. "The barn door, the fence on the north side, the additional room when Samuel is old enough to need his own. There is always something that needs building." She had looked at him for a long time, at the man who had ridden into her life with a torn coat and a cut hand and a quality of stillness that turned out not to be emptiness but depth, who had stayed not because he had nowhere else to go but because he had chosen to, who had built the porch and the trust and the family, and the town with the same fundamental conviction that good things were worth the work of making. "I love you," she had said. It was not the first time. They had said it many times in the ordinary daily way of people who mean it and keep meaning it. But there were moments when it needed to be said with its full weight, when the accumulated everything of a life together needed a word big enough to hold it, and this was one of those moments. "I love you," he had said back, in exactly the same tone, with exactly the same weight. The children continued their operations in the yard. Samuel slept. The September light went golden and long across the prairie. The porch held them all solid and unhurried, the first plank and the last one built to last, built with intention, built by a man who had stopped moving and found that what he was stopping for was worth more than any distance he had covered before. She had asked the drifter if he ever planned to settle down. He had said he was already planning the porch. And he had been, and he did. And it had been the most real thing either of them had ever been part of, and it had held and held and held.